So I guess Croco Boy is up next. So I guess there's only one thing we can do about this. Eh, 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 eh. See you in the video. Welcome back, crewmates. We have the Crocodile deck for today's little video. So we're going to go through it, going ahead and organize the deck in the Nakama Decks format for ease of going through things. And I'm going to talk about, the advantage engine in the deck, maybe some little card combos, what things go good together, and the overall style of the deck in general. The style of this deck is a kind of a grind deck. You want to control the tempo. This card has a lot of cards that return things to the opponent's hand, set them back. Because in this game you have summoning sickness, so unless your character has a rush, your character cannot attack that turn. So if you set up an attacker, or any card, and you pass to the opponent, and they bounce it to your hand, you're going to have to spend a turn playing it again, and then waiting to attack with it. So if you can control the way that your opponent is playing cards and deciding yourself when they can attack, you're pretty much playing the deck the way it is meant to be played, I would think. So our big boss of the deck is the leader Crocodile. That's a little laggy, but okay. It says, Dawn -4, return one character with a cost of 5 or less to the owner's hand. So this is what I'm talking about with a lot of the bounce effects that are going to come up multiple times in this deck. But this is a reusable one that you don't lose throughout the game. You'll always have access to your leader. But with a Dawn -4 effect and no ramp in the blue deck, you're going to have to decide when and where you want to use that effect, because you don't want to neg yourself too many Dawn, or else you're not going to be able to play cards. So what's that sweet spot? You definitely don't want to use it too early, because the first time you can use it when you have 4 Dawn, and if you go to 4, if you neg yourself at 4, as soon as you're at 4, you're going to be at 2 next turn. You're not going to be able to play cards, you're going to be way too far behind the opponent. But in the late game, when you have 10 Dawn, and you get rid of 4 Dawn and go to 6, on the follow-up you're going to have 8 Dawn, which is plenty of Dawn to work with regularly. And then on the following turn you go back up to 10, so you're going to be able to use this card every other turn effectively to kind of mess around with the opponent. And that's a pretty decent amount of messing around that you can do with the opponent, because you're never going to not be able to have access to this. Now, let's see, I think I'll start with the advantage engine. How does this deck plus? And by plus, I mean get more resources to your hand so that you have more things to grind with the opponent. And there are two standout cards, and one card that just lets you draw, right? And the first standout card is Gecko Moria. As soon as that wants to load, okay. So Gecko Moria, when played for 4, lets you add a 7 Warlords of the Sea or Thriller Bark Pirates with a cost 4 or less from your trash to your hand. So as soon as he's played, you get to add any of those types from your graveyard to your hand. So that's an immediately +1 in card economy. And what can this do for you? So over here you can get a Mihawk, and Mihawk is a 2k card, 2k counter, so that's always good to be able to recycle. This Teach down here is a small bounce effect for a cost 3 or less, so that's good. This Boa, which you can get, is a blocker, and this Law you can get is a blocker. And those are pretty much the best targets. You can also get, the Kuma, the Jinbei, the Vanillas. Well, not the Pacifista, but these Vanillas. But my favorite cards to get are the Mihawk, because it's a 2k guard that you can recycle, and the blockers, which allows Moria to be played as an attacker and set up for a blocker. So that's good to have. And when you use it on the Law blocker over here, he's just the little 1-drop guy. I'm gonna let him pop up. There we go. So when you pay the Moria for 4, you can get the Law back, and then for 1, you get a attacker for next turn and a blocker for 5. Good. The Teach, as I was telling you, is another little bounce card. When he's played, you can bounce a 3 or less to the owner's hand. So he's not terrible, but he is a 4k, so you're going to need to put a little more investment into him for him to be able to attack. Needs a bit more cherry pies. But let's go back into the advantage engine of the deck, which is the All-Star, which is Sentomaru, who ironically is not a 7 Warlords. He is a Navy man, but he is the, quote-unquote best advantage engine in the deck, because for a Dawn under him and 2 Dawn once per turn, you can just summon a cost 4 or less Pacifista from the deck. So what is the cost 4 or less Pacifista? It's your 6k vanilla. So every turn, by paying 3, essentially, because you give him 1 and then you pay 2, you can just pop out a 6k from your deck. And as long as Sentomaru doesn't die, you can keep doing that, until you run out of Pacifistas. And if you don't attack with Sentomaru, he's a little sticky to the board. He's a little hard to get rid of. That's your main advantage, and the honorary advantage card is Love Beam over here in the events. So Love Beam is the 2 cost, and you gain 4k to your character or your leader, and then if you have 3 or less cards in your hand, you get to draw a card. So it immediately replaces itself, and it's just a lot of value. So when you're blocking and you have Love Beam and you're planning on playing it, just make sure that your Love Beam is the 4th or less card in your hand, because when you play it, you go down to 3. That's how you get value. And that is the main advantage engine of the deck. The other way that you want to play this deck, besides trying to gather resources, like in any real game that you want to do that in, is setting the tempo, and that's using your bounce effects. So who has bounce effects? So your Doflamingo has a bounce effect, your Teach has a bounce effect, your leader has the bounce effect, and then your Sabble's event and your Thrustpad Cannon. There's a lot of bouncing, so you want to know how to use your bounces effectively, so that you don't just play them for no reason. And by that is, you really don't want to use bounces on cards that have already attacked that are rested if you don't need to, because it would just be better for you to just kind of swing into those cards and just clear them completely. Using the bounces on cards that haven't attacked yet, or are going to attack, that need to be set up again, which set your opponent back, and give you more time to kind of poke, gain resources, is where you want to be in this deck. And then the big blocker Crocodile here is a little bit different. He doesn't bounce, and he actually, straight up removes things, which is a little awkward. We know more cards should do that, but he's a blocker, 5k, 6,000, and when blocking, if he has a Dawn under him, you can return a character with cost 3 or less to the bottom of the owner's deck. So because it's so small of a cost, there's not that many cards that you're going to be able to put back under. You just look at the board, right? You establish what's going on, and if your opponent has a 2 or a 1 on the board, you can give him a Dawn, and then next turn when you block with him, you just get that off the field for free. But if they don't have one, there's no need to invest in. He's just a good 6k blocker. This deck also has a lot of block, actually. It's the 2 Crocodile, and then Boa is the blocker, and Chi's a 4-of, and Law is a blocker, who is a 4-of. So you actually have 10 blockers in this deck. It's a very defensive, thick deck in the blocker aspect instead of the in-hand aspect. Because Sabble and Thrustpad Cannon do not give you any power. Those aren't the type of cards they are. And you only have 2 Mihawk, which are the 2k guards. So you actually don't have a lot of hard guard, but what you do have is blocker. So that's kind of where the balance went, is when they were making this deck, I suppose. The Doflamingo is your biggest bounce, right next to Sabble's. So on play, you can return a character who costs 7 or less to the owner's hand, so you want to be able to kind of play the Dofi when you can get value out of it. So when you want to get value out of it, if they're setting up an attacker, or just played a card last turn that doesn't have rush, right? You can play the Dofi to really set them back, because if it's a big guy, if you get the full value and send a 7 back, they're going to have to pay 7 again to play it. And that's a lot of investment. That means they played 7 and they didn't get any value out of it, because you played a 7 and stuck the 7 to bounce it, and they have to play it again. But while the bounce tempo is, all fine and good, he is a 7k body, and that's really nice for just having this big guy that stands and you just swing in. 7k is a magic number. It's 2k above the leader, and he's just always that big. And he's a little bit difficult to get over unless they put some major investment in one of their guys to try and attack for him. So that is always good. The Mihawk has a good effect and his good counter. He has a Dawn skill. When attacking, draw 2 and trash 2 cards. Now this is an advantage. It is a filter, and a filter is you get to see more cards, but it doesn't actually plus you. You're going through your deck to try and get to the things you want to see, but you're not gaining advantage, because you will immediately throw out 2 after getting it. But he's a very good card, but it's also kind of where you're like, do I want to play him because he's the 2k guard? So he's really good on the board, and he's really good in your hand. And unfortunately, you only get 2 of them. Like I was saying, with Teach is a small bounce. He does 3 or less. Yep, 3 or less, and he's 4k. Boa is a very interesting card because she is a trigger. and she is a blocker trigger, the only blocker trigger, I believe. Pretty sure. So when she gets hit out of your life, you can play her for free and just have a blocker. So in the middle of your opponent's attack phase, you can just get a blocker out. And that can not only, be annoying for your opponent, but it could actually completely save you in a death scenario, which is nice. And she is a 3 cost for 1,000, which is the same stat line as Law, but you have to pay a little extra just to have that trigger line on there. Plus, she has 1,000 guard. So unlike the 1-drop blockers, you can actually guard with her in hand if you don't want to play her. The Centaur, the other trigger, you actually have a second trigger body, which is this Kuma. Fortunately, he does not have guard. That's always the first thing I really think of when I see this card. But on play, you get to rearrange top 3 cards of your deck, and if you don't like any of them, you can put them on the bottom 2. Alright, but, wish you had guard. Going into the other 2 events. So, Sables is the same exact effect as Dofi. Sables 4/4 lets you bounce a 7 or less to the opponent's hand, and then the trigger does that effect. This is a 4 of. I don't really think of it as a 4 of, especially when you have your leader. So, but being able to bounce like 2 things, like if you use Sables on 1, and then you tap 4 to play Sables, and then you can immediately send the 4 you tapped off Sables to use Crocodile's second Sables, and just really put them back tempo-wise, is things that I've done with this deck in the past, which are really nice if your opponent's starting to flood the board, because that's actually something that happens. Because while you're controlling the tempo of the game, you're not actually removing any of these threats. You just keep bouncing them back to their hands so that they have to replay them. Eventually, they're going to get to the point where they have a big handful of attackers, and at one point they can flood the board with them, right? If there's a bunch of 3-drops, you can play 3 3-drops in one turn, or 2 3s and a 4 if you're at 10. So at one point, after you're bouncing all their guys back, they're just going to have all these attackers and just try and play them all at once, because if you play just one attacker against this deck, they're going to control the tempo, and you're never going to get any attacks off beside one here. So when they drop all of those guys back out, being able to use Sables and your leader in one turn is usually pretty nice, because you get to clear 2 of them. And then Thrust Pike Cannon is really funny, because for 2, you get to return a cost 3 or less to the owner's hand as a counter. So instead of bouncing it on your turn, you leave 2 up, and then when they attack with that 3 they're going to attack with, you bounce it to their hand, the attack just fizzles, and then they have to replay it and then go through the whole process again if they don't have rush. It's summoning thing. You can really set the tempo with this deck. There are loads of bounces. So you have the Thrust Pike Cannon, you have the Sables, you have the leader himself, you have the Teach, and you have the Doflamingo. With all those tools at your disposal, you really want to try and control the game by limiting the amount of attacks your opponent can have. That's really the main purpose of this deck. So, since it's Crocodile man-based, go ahead and give a Desert Espada to the sub button so that you're up to date with all the new videos we do. I don't think there's much else I need to talk about in this deck, but as a question of the day for fun, since this is a 7 of the Warlords deck title, why don't you go ahead and tell me what your favorite Warlord of the Sea is? And I'll see you in the next one, guys. Thank you for watching.